Excuse me, everyone. I appreciate we're all having lunch right now, but if you wouldn't mind quieting down, we're going to have our lunchtime keynote panel here focused on commercialization. We have a wonderful panel of speakers, and first I'll pass it to our moderator, Alissa Peterson, co-founder and CEO of SeaAhead.
All right. Thanks, everyone, and thanks for sharing your lunch with us today. Like Corey said, my name is Alissa Peterson, and I'm co-founder and executive director of SeaAhead, and we work with startups that have an application in an ocean-related industry or that will contribute to the improvement of ocean health. And so offshore wind's a big growth area that we focus on. We run an incubator, we have an accelerator down in the Gulf Coast now as well, in addition to our work here in the Cambridge area. And we also have an investment group that's invested in 22 startups to date since we founded them about 2.5 years ago. So we've been pretty active. And so I am excited to introduce to you today this panel. And as a background, I was talking with our partners at NOWRDC about commercialization, and they spend quite a bit of time, effort, resources, and passion on funding impactful research that with the goal of near-term solutions that can be deployed in offshore wind. And so when we were thinking about this panel, we were thinking about how do we bring together experts that can talk about this from the investment, from the accelerator, from the international economic development and startup perspectives. And so this keynote today features folks that we thought would be able to bring you this variety and depth of experience. And we hope that you'll ask questions on the Slido, which we'll take toward the end of this conversation. And it's just going to be a moderated Q&A. So that's what we're going to do here today. So I'd like to have the panelists introduce themselves. Hilary, would you like to start?
Sure, I'll go first. Hi everyone, I'm Hilary Flynn. I'm the Managing Director of Investments for the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, or MassCEC. We are an economic development organization that is focused on helping the state of Massachusetts reach its decarbonization goals. So we provide grant funding for startups. We do incentives for market development, and then what my team does is make venture capital investments in startups across a range of technology areas. This year, we're launching a $50 million early stage venture capital fund that we're calling the 2030 Fund. And the very first investment that we made was in offshore wind company called Triton Anchor, which is here today. And the other categories that we invest in are grid technologies, buildings, and transportation. Before I joined MassCEC, I was the head of offshore wind for National Grid Ventures and did the partnership with RWE. And before that was in National Grid's venture capital and innovation arm called National Grid Partners, where I was also doing early stage venture investing. And then prior to that, I was a consultant for many years in emerging technology.
Thank you, Hilary. Next up, Matt.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. So Matt Womble, I'm the Director of Ocean Data Programs at SailDRONE. For those of you that don't know what SailDRONE is, we are an uncrewed surface vehicle owner, manufacturer, and operator. So we operate 3 different classes of uncrewed surface vehicles that operate on the surface of the ocean, especially built for metocean data collection, ocean mapping, and maritime domain awareness capabilities. I guess I'm the lone sort of industry and startup person on the panel. While I appreciate others may be experts, I'm probably definitely not an expert in what we'll be talking about, but excited to be here today to chat with you all, share SailDRONE's perspective, and learn and be able to talk about some of the work we're doing with offshore wind.
I think you'll be able to add a lot to the panel. All right, Tony.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Søndergaard, and I'm the director of the Offshore Wind Innovation Hub, which is a newly started initiative in Industry City in Brooklyn, New York. The Offshore Wind Innovation Hub is driven by NYU Tandem School of Engineering, but it's a partnership between Equinor, NOWRDC, and the Economic Development Corporation in New York City as well. We are an offshore wind accelerator program, so we will be working a lot with startups and assisting them with getting a foothold in the American offshore wind industry, hopefully. But we are also a co-working space, so we have a beautiful space in Industry City that is just waiting for all our startups to move into. I have currently been in my role for only 1 month, so you will have to excuse me if there's things I do not have to answer yet. And the Innovation Hub itself is actually launching in January, so this is a little bit of a sneak peek, maybe for some of you, on what it is that we're going to do down there. But yeah, thank you.
All right, so we're going to ask you all of those different
I know.
Yeah. All right, excellent. So let's speed this up a little bit for the audience. We're going to be talking about, we're talking here with technologists who are evaluating the opportunity for commercialization. And let's start by going around and just talking a little bit about what you think are some of the most critical success factors that you can think about that would make a technologist looking at commercialization successful in the space.
You first? I'm happy to go first. So, I think there's a couple of things just to keep it really high level. The first is solving a problem, and that sounds really simple, but sometimes there are innovations that really just aren't solving a big enough or impactful enough problem. I think generally technologies that can fit into an existing way that things are done tend to have an easier time getting adopted, but that doesn't mean that there are other technologies that aren't worth pursuing for that reason. That's kind of the thing about innovation. Sometimes it needs to be super disruptive, but generally the things that can slip into an existing way of working, the easiest tend to be adopted more quickly. And then the last kind of high-level thing I'll say is solving a problem for the decision maker is also pretty critical, because sometimes you get a situation where you have a really great innovation, but the people that would be paying for it or buying it aren't the people that it's actually solving the problem for, and so you have this disconnect between who has the problem and who would actually be selecting the technology.
Yeah, and I can add on to that, like the Offshore Wind Innovation Hub is part of the Urban Future Lab, which for the last 10 years have done both incubator and accelerator programs. I'm sort of like pulling a little bit on many good colleagues there. But in what you say, I think we look for that all the time as well. Like, are you able to communicate what problem you're solving, and can you actually sort of like explain that value proposition to a very diverse set of stakeholders, right? Like, it is, as you precisely say, it's very difficult sometimes to have one technology, but you need to speak very differently to different audiences. And a founder who can figure out how to do that quickly will sort of like see more progress than those that struggle more with that. I also think one of the things we always look at a lot is the team and the founders themselves behind it. It's a really critical component. Like, you can have the best idea and solve all the problems in the world, but if you don't have a team, and if you don't have the personality essentially to go out there and make this a reality, your startup will probably never really make it big. So that's really, I think, we also evaluate a lot when we see all our applications coming in. Yeah.
I don't have a lot to add to those. I mean, compelling, the thing I guess the phrase I was going to use was a compelling use case. That's how we phrase what we try to sell at SailDrone. We think we have a very compelling use case for our platform. There's a need for sustained long-term marine ocean observations that aren't spatially or temporally limited, and we have a platform to be able to go solve that. So it's just creating that clear use case, and then I think trying to best articulate as saliently as you can how what you're developing does that. And then, to a certain extent, taking risk to go at least provide some evidence of the fact that what you're proposing can do that. And I think everybody, to some degree, people wait for the big contract or other things to come through, and to some degree, a lot of what people want to see is that initial little tidbit that can clue them into what you're thinking, what you're proposing actually can solve the problem.
So a lot of the technologists here will be looking out for funding of various kinds, and venture capital funding is one of those areas. And so, Hilary, building on this kind of key success factors conversation, are there other aspects that you're looking for when you are making decisions about which companies to fund in the space? And is there anything specific about this offshore wind industry in particular, among, of the sort of different kinds of energy areas that you're looking at?
Yeah, so I would say for us as a climate-focused firm or organization, we're really looking for companies that can make an impact on carbon, which offshore wind does. So that's kind of a, check that box pretty quickly. Not all things that we look at would fit that bill. And then also, as Tona said, team, we really, a lot of the companies that we're looking at, whether it's offshore or other areas, it's very often started by very technical people, and that's great, and we look for that, but we also look for whether they have some business acumen as well, and sometimes very early on they don't. So if we're doing a pre-seed investment, many times it could be two technical founders that got their PhD and they just spun out a company. But what we're looking for is, with some early funding, they're bringing in someone that can commercialize and understand how to grow a business and sell a product. So that's another thing we look at. And another thing is really, because this is equity and not grant funding, we are looking for a business that can attract other investors. That's one of the metrics we look at. How much other outside capital have we leveraged with the money that we've put in? And so we're really looking at every company in terms of how will it exit. So will it won't likely IPO, or it could, but that's not super typical in climate tech. It usually is an M&A exit. And so what's the likely opportunity for M&A? Who are the potential acquirers? Will this attract other capital? Is it a venture business? Some businesses are just not venture businesses. They could grow on their own. They're not going to have an exit that will attract additional capital. So those are some of the things that we also look for.
Thanks. Did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I can maybe sort of like just from the startup perspective add a little bit to that conversation. Like at the future level, of course, we have, like right now, I think there's around 60 portfolio companies as sort of part of the incubators and these different accelerators that we have sort of have. And for many of the founders that we work with, the conversation with the investor is the most challenging for many of them, right? It's the one that they're most unfamiliarized with in many ways. It's where they have to pivot that sort of like that storyline about what they're bringing to the table more than what they're used to in many cases. And I just sort of like everyone who's kind of considering that and are in the fundraising sort of like stages, like really consider joining some of these incubators or accelerators. Like for instance, at the future lab we call it the pitch book, and it literally means every time either of us talk to an investor, and there's a very large investor network that's sort of like that each of us sort of interact with, we have all sort of like 45 companies who are currently raising money with us out there and can kind of pitch them. And sort of like depending on what that investor is looking for. So sort of like even sort of like being part of these kind of accelerator programs means that you have like small sort of like investment scouts looking out for you essentially everywhere. And I'm just sort of like, I think that's really important because it is really difficult for one startup all the time to sort of like, oh, I talk to Hilary about this, and to keep track of this like investor network is a massive task for most founders. So yeah.
Absolutely, it is absolutely a challenge. So as you're, I want to build on something that we were just talking about as well. You're working with Equinor, and at SeaAhead we have had a long-standing relationship with Ørsted, and so I've been thinking a lot about developers in the supply chain and how the companies within the supply chain are looking at engaging with startups and engaging with these, whether or not they're a startup in the traditional sense or not, or a small business. How you're seeing those players in the supply chain looking at working with these young companies.
Yeah, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say about this as well. But I'm happy to take a first step. I think one of the things that we're really seeing that is very different when we at the Open Future Lab and the Offshore Wind Innovation Hub do these, we call them corporate accelerators, right? Where there's essentially a corporate sponsor who is really interested in working with startups and using an accelerator program as sort of outsourced R&D arm in some shape or form, right? There's sort of like, depending on what industry we're in and what we're doing in it, it differs a little bit what the corporate partners are really looking for. But I think what is interesting with the offshore wind industry, for sure, and especially maybe this Equinor case, is there is a lot of interest in working with startups precisely because it's one of the ways that they can also achieve some of their DEI sort of like targets. Like you have to kind of go out there and work with smaller companies if you want to sort of really do well within that space.
And local content requirements, right?
Precisely, right? And also in the case of the Offshore Wind Hub, Offshore Wind Innovation Hub, like, we're looking very much on how to include some of the very localized businesses. This is in Sunset Park in Brooklyn, and those of you who are sort of like familiarized with that area, it's a very sort of like historically Hispanic community, and figuring out how do we include some of that into an accelerator program like this. And I think that's really where some of the developers see some value in bringing in accelerators or sort of like innovation hubs like ours to try and see if we can mitigate and come up with some new ways of doing that. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we've worked with Ørsted now on getting 3 pilots, sort of into play. And I think the key for us and getting those done in our work together has been identifying, Ørsted has for those of you who don't know already, an innovation division that's headquartered in Providence, Rhode Island, and so here in the U.S. And so finding for them and working with them to help identify within the larger organization who can actually own it, right? Because it can't stay inside of the innovation part of the organization. It has to have an owner somewhere else within the organization. And so working with them to identify key areas that are of interest, and then helping them select of the companies that are coming through, who they might want to work with, and then getting that then to the next point, which is how do you identify both the budget and the owner within this larger organization. And so it's not a small task from a developer or a perspective to identify ways in which to work with small companies, because it's when you get down to it, at the end of the day, like for the pilots themselves, it's no one's job, quote unquote, to do those things. And so you really have to have a strong, push through the organization from somewhere that says like, hey, this could be a good idea.
Yeah, I completely align with that as well. And I think one of the things that this Offshore Wind Innovation Hub is trying to also do a little bit differently in terms of that is the Offshore Wind Accelerator itself is co-located with Equinor. So we are sharing the same coffee machines, essentially, right? And then there's just conversation that happens over the coffee machine sometimes when we have a flow of just like startups and small businesses that literally comes into the space. That first of all creates a very cool kind of like a non-corporate vibe that I think a lot of people might sort of like. But it also kind of like in some shape or form a little bit what you are hinting to, right? There's some of those barriers you can kind of break down a little bit if you have a little bit more face time, literally not that type of face time, the real face time, with some of the coworkers or some of the corporate partners that you are actually looking to do a pilot with or get investments from or whatever your mission is.
Yeah, absolutely. And Hilary, just taking it back to the work that you did also at National Grid, as you were thinking about investing at MassCEC, are you looking at how you're selecting and what you're doing differently than you looked at it when you were looking at it from the National Grid perspective?
Yeah, there's certainly some similarities and some differences. So ultimately, in both cases, you want a return on the investment, an attractive return. So that's always part of the requirement. But with MassCEC, it's much more about decarbonization and how does it help with that and create jobs locally and economic activity locally. When I was at Grid, at National Grid Partners, it was a lot of what you were saying about with Ørsted, where many of the investments had to have some business unit that would value that investment and be able to benefit from it. And so we would have to have someone sponsor the investment and many times be willing to do some sort of pilot or exploration of some sort with the company we were investing in, and most of the investments would need to provide some sort of operational efficiency or new market entry with the investment that was being made. There were some investments we could do that were what we would call pathfinding, which didn't have to have a sponsor, but that wasn't the majority of the investments. And it is really challenging because, like you said, I don't know anyone. I mean, I worked on an innovation team, and I don't even think any of my metrics of success had innovation as part of the metric of success, surprisingly. So finding those people and the really forward-thinking people in the organization that are willing to take that on, that's probably not part of their day job, can be really challenging. And you need someone internally, like I had that job, of just bringing people together and translating between large corporation and startup, because many of the issues that you see at a large corporation as well, especially when we're talking about things like energy, you have cybersecurity, you have safety that you have to consider, and these are really important things that many times there's a different level of understanding and expectation between a startup and a very large corporation. So you need to kind of come together and work through those things.
Yeah, I think that plays a lot into the concept of partnerships and how you think about, not just investment, but partnering within the supply chain. So Matt, you're in a startup that has NOWRDC funding, and partnerships, of course, are a big part of securing that funding. And so I'm interested in learning more and thinking about how SailDrone's thought about partnerships in its trajectory.
Yeah, I mean, specific for the offshore wind space, it's a huge component for us. Take, for example, our NOWRDC project that we're partnering with RPS, and that's a product of the fact that what we are providing is the end goal of the project is a data stream, but that data stream in and of itself is inherently a lot less value than if you can actually apply some data or some intelligence as a result of that data stream. So the acoustic data stream we're able to provide, partnering with RPS, who has the capabilities and the technologies already developed to take that acoustic data stream and produce intelligence off of it about localization, identification, detection of mammals. And so that's an incredible partnership for us. If we didn't have that partnership on the back end, our value proposition, the idea of what we were trying to do, the use case, would be a lot less valuable. But you look beyond just the NOWRDC opportunities. SailDrone does a lot of work with seabed mapping and multimeter bathymetry. In and of itself, we can do that work just as many of the large primes that typically do that work in the offshore space. Except for the fact, again, we're a data provider. We're not a full-scale bathymetry mapping company, so there's a lot of work that has to be done on the back end with post-processing of that data. That's partnerships that we can partner with groups to be able to do that, or go in with the primes and do the work of actual mapping to send that data and allow them to use their resources to do it. So for us, where we're just solving a specific problem, we're trying to provide environmental data across 3 different verticals, we have to be able to have partnerships to be able to provide the additional use of that data to the ultimate end customer.
As y'all, either Tony or Hilary, as you've been working with startups, have you seen any sort of best practices around partnering with larger organizations, or any sort of carefuls or other things that you'd want to mention as as we're talking about this topic?
Want to do it first?
Sure, I'll go first. So I think it depends on the stage that the startup is in. So what I often see is very early stage startups, what I would hope that they've done is do a lot of talking with all kinds of different potential partners to kind of scope out how their technology fits in with the ecosystem, what some of the barriers will be, the reaction, how much, I think a lot of startups are surprised to realize how much the people that are working on their similar technology within a large corporation know so much about that area, because they've done that likely for their whole career. So it's a really useful piece of feedback to do those, 100 customer discovery interviews, which as accelerators, you know.
We enforce it.
And then, you know, as they get a little bit more mature, I would look for companies to have some sort of pilot program with a large company or some sort of partner that doesn't tie them up with that company, because you know, you're early on, you might sign a JDA, but you don't want to lose your IP to another corporation that early. But you do want to be doing pilots and testing out the technology and kicking the tires. And then, you know, once you get to a later stage, I would look for partners in the form of investors, strategic investors, corporate venture capital, but you don't want those too early, because that can cause some kind of competition or maybe keep some other investors, corporates away. So then, you know, later on they would do that. But so I think it kind of depends on the level they're at, and as they, you know, get more mature, there would be a little bit more engagement with corporates.
Yeah, I think I can just echo all you just said, and I think especially the part about as a small startup team not losing yourself into a very, very big sort of like corporation, you can easily be sucked in. Like really be careful about that. Be flexible, but not too flexible. Kind of know your red lines. What are you willing to compromise on? How willing are you to push the boundaries of your innovation and what you're trying to actually do? That's really key. And then for many of the startups we also work with, there isn't necessarily a lot of different kinds. So it can feel very sort of overwhelming if that one grid operator that you are interested in working with does not really sort of like what you're doing, or are pushing you really hard. So sort of finding a way as the startup team to sort of like keep an outlook while still being engaged is also a balance for many of them to sort of strike.
Yeah, don't sell your company before you've actually sold your company. That's a good one. And so I want to pick up on a thread that I heard as we were talking, which is about the barriers to commercialization that are out there, right? And finding the right partners and getting them to agree to work with you is just one of them, right? There are other kinds of barriers that are present in this space for folks who are trying to commercialize here. They could be structural or regulatory, et cetera. Like, what kinds of barriers do you think, you know, that you've seen in your space, Matt, where SailDrone's had to overcome those in order to get to market?
Yeah, it's
they're myriad.
They're myriad.
Yeah.
I mean, I think for us, from the SailDrone perspective, the thing, particularly with, and it's an interesting juxtaposition between how government approaches it and how industry approaches it. So the vast majority of our work to date has been with government agencies, NOAA, NASA, USGS, Navy, others doing work, and we find that the government has pretty high risk tolerance for something that is new, right? We're coming in proposing to do a lot of work that's traditionally been done on ships or other ocean assets, buoys, gliders, from an uncrewed mobile asset that can go around and sail about for up to 365 days, collect all the data, and do all the work. And that's something completely new, right? And the risk tolerance the risk tolerance you see from government, for example, is like, that sounds awesome, that solves a huge problem for us, let's put it out there, let's see how it works. From an industry side, it's the same reaction, but it's to some degree, I think, show me it works, and show me it works again, show me it works again, show me it works again, because it is so new. And I think, you know, specifically for offshore wind, you look at it, there's the ultimate here. These are businesses that have a bottom line, they're going to make money, taking a big risk on a new technology that has some perspective in existing technology that already does the work that we're proposing to do. Although I'd argue we do it at a zero carbon footprint, which is I think incredibly valuable for the proposition of offshore wind. Getting over that hump of this is something new, this is a risk tolerance, has probably been our biggest challenge. Or I don't say challenge, but the biggest issue we've seen.
Yeah.
I can tag on to that, just saying, like, it's what we see with all our startups that we work with, right? Like, pilot testing is such an incredibly important part of, like, coming to commercializations, but it is also the absolute most difficult part. And I think sort of, like, at least when we were starting thinking about how we were going to do this offshore wind accelerator program, one of the challenges we ran into fairly quickly is we have a total of 5 turbines to test stuff on, and I guess Ørsted might be a little bit tired soon of like wanting to sort of like more people wanting to test things out on the little that's actually out there, and that's just one of the things that's really different in when I talk to my European colleagues who are running offshore wind accelerators, right? They have quite a lot of turbines and infrastructure and grid and all this other stuff to like test out on. So it's really one of the things that we're trying to figure out, like how are we gonna, in this program, figure out this pilot testing component and precisely like help with that risk minimization from the customer perspective without necessarily having as much infrastructure to test on. And there is also just a few limited sort of like tier 1 sort of like suppliers essentially that you can potentially work with. It's difficult to do 100 sort of like customer discovery conversations if you're an offshore wind startup. You might have 5 if you're lucky, right? And then you sort of like.
Yeah, I think for building on that, for us when we work with startups on customer discovery, we ask them to draw the boundaries of what they consider a customer to be really broadly, because they can learn a lot from talking to players that sell other things to the same customer or who sell a similar thing that they sell to a totally different market. And so those discovery conversations we've sort of recast a little bit, because when you call them customer discovery conversations, people start to think like, oh, I can only talk to customers, but they have a lot, and of course we want them to talk to their customers, for essays, right? But we also think that there's a lot that they can learn from these tangential players in the market, which will give them insights that the customer will never provide about how they buy, right? Because the customer has very limited ability to reflect on that, to be frank, right? And so I'm wondering, as you've been, thinking about these barriers, for any of you, if you think that these barriers are similar or different in offshore wind than they are in other energy sectors, right? And so, one area that might be different is the lack of places to test, right? Whereas if you're doing other kinds of work in energy, there might be a lot more places to test. Are there other things that are specifically either better or different or harder about offshore wind?
I guess to some degree the newness of offshore wind in the United States with the regulatory functions that, and trying to find specifically, our, for example, just specific to SailDrone, our niche within that. What are the problem sets that we're going to specifically dial in and try to solve? One thing, going back to Tone's point, I think this too is there's this, the word pilot gets used way too much, and for the sake of like a startup city, or we're at a pretty advanced sort of startup stage of SailDrone, and when we see pilot, we almost shy away from pilot because it typically is, and we don't consider what we're doing with NOWRDC a pilot. And so I strongly encourage people to think about the difference between what a pilot is, which can often have excitement at the beginning, but it's hard to really define what the end result of that pilot is going to be. Sort of seems like a successive approach of trying to make perfect the enemy good enough, versus a thing like what NOWRDC is doing here, where you have the option to set and define schedule and a real outcome. You're involving advisory boards, and people can look at it, and looking more at that kind of approach to commercialization versus the pilot approach, which is just this sort of catch-all for show me what you can do and then we'll follow up.
I can maybe also add like another component making offshore wind startups sometimes challenge is the water component. It's sort of like, maybe you know that from sort of like working a lot on different sort of like water-based technologies, but again it's sort of like it adds a layer of complexity to what you're trying to do that's just difficult. And me having conversations with the city of New York, trying to figure out where in the New York City harbor can we just at least allow some of the startups to put something in water, just adds a completely different layer of complexity and stakeholders to the mix of figuring it out. So water in itself is just not the easiest, actually. Yeah.
All right, audience, I'm looking at the Slido and you're failing on me here, so I'm calling you out now. I'll keep going, but if you guys got questions, you gotta help me out here. So let's take a slightly different tact. I'm interested in digging in a little bit on where you all are seeing the most exciting innovations coming from right now. Are there Are there things that you're particularly like, oh wow, this is going to be cool?
Sure. Well, so I'll maybe spin that a little bit and say I would love to see more.
Okay, all right.
I think that there's definitely offshore innovation happening, but given how much work needs to be done to lower the cost of these technologies, and particularly in floating platforms, surveying, monitoring, optimization, planning. I would love to see more technologies out there. And I think especially on the cost reduction side of things, that's why we were excited about Triton, that they can help reduce the cost of these installations, which will, as the industry gets bigger, will become even more and more important that it be cost competitive. So that is my kind of pitch, is we need more.
I guess I can give to some degree the SailDRONE sales pitch, but yeah, for us, it's solving the gap of being able to provide observations on a spatial and time series that you can't currently get, and solving that niche. So we're providing long time series observations with an asset that can move around. So we're not spatially limited, we're not time series limited. So we can do all that, plus the addition to be able to add sensors to that. I think the exciting thing for us, and really one of the big compelling use cases for offshore wind, is we're decarbonizing the fleet that is required to go out and service these systems, or whether it's servicing buoys, whether it's out towing a PAM array off of a big diesel burning ship, any of those things, we're completely decarbonizing it. Our platforms are completely renewable power. They use wind for propulsion, they use sunlight for power, and so I think it's a good additive to the offshore wind proposition, and we're decarbonizing other things, and now we're also not having a bunch of big dirty diesel burning ships out there as well. We're minimizing what they can do, and then I think it's adding innovation into the space. Right, we're using autonomous technologies that are completely uncrewed. We're applying a lot of artificial intelligence and machine learning on top of that. So we're bringing the best of innovation from other sectors and applying it to offshore wind, particularly in this case in the maritime service space.
And I know that your center is not launched yet, but and I don't know if you would if you want to give us a sneak peek, but are there any specific areas of innovation that you all are going to be really looking at hard?
For sure there is.
But you won't tell us.
And you'll have to come for the launch party on the 25th of January to get the full sort of
okay. Well,
but
the cell has been launched.
Yeah, no, for sure. No, but I'm happy to sort of because I think sort of what is also me being here these 2 days have become really evident is that there's some really interesting innovations going on within the spaces that is very US specific. And I think especially when you think about running an accelerator program where we want to create a localized and sort of American-based sort of supply chain, figuring out how the US can, how we can sort of assist startups that are specifically within, maybe it's floating wind, because it's really one of the areas where the US, maybe is relatively sort of far ahead, and also sort of within deployment sort of technologies and things, because it's just such an American, we heard it before, right? It's a thing that none of the European developers have dealt with before. So I think there's lots of sort of innovations, and I think when our RFP is coming out for startups, I think there's a good chance that some of those things will make it in there, because it's what we need to see innovations in.
Excellent. Well, my push to the audience has yielded us a few questions. So we have an audience member that's wondering, to what extent any of your organizations reach down into colleges and universities, to sort of pull up or pull out innovation, funding capstone projects, et cetera, to get students involved in the industry?
I'll say many times we don't on the investment side because it's really early, but we do have several grant programs available, and we do see quite a few startup, researchers in the universities then licensing the technology they developed in the university and then try to do a pilot and look to us for funding, and some of that funding in the form of non-dilutive funding is matched by federal government funding, and we do have existing relationships with those universities across the different technology areas we cover, not just offshore, and we have funded several offshore startups that have spun out of universities.
That's right. I almost don't want to tell you, but MassCEC has this really great internship program. We always had interns on it. Now everybody's going to fight me for it. But yes, we've had 2 or 3 interns a semester funded with MassCEC. So thank you.
I would just say from the SailDRONE side, university partners are huge for us. Universities sometimes are customers. In a lot of instances, universities are development partners, particularly when we were a much smaller company, still developing the platform. There's no better place to go tap into than universities to help you design systems, pick out sensors, help integrate sensors, and check the quality of the data. We still work a ton with universities on the quality of the data. We're a data company ultimately, so yeah, that's the #1 priority for us. That chains amounts to whether that's working with distinct PIs within different universities or supporting graduate students to help with specific projects. It's sort of a whole gamut for us, but we look at it as sort of an additive intellectual powerhouse that we can add to help us solve specific problems with the products that we're developing.
Yeah, and I can maybe add, actually being from NYU, it is very obviously sort of like the whole point of having an accelerator program that is part of the engineering school is to facilitate all the students at NYU Tandem to have access to it. I think between the sort of just Urban Future alone, which is kind of like where there's sort of 40, 50 sort of startups connected to right now, it's I think 100, 150 interns a year that we're facilitating, just with getting into those companies. It's quite staggering, especially in summer times where sort of summer interns come in. We have many of our startups take on 4, 5, 6 summer interns at a time to literally progress on some specific sort of challenge that they're having. And of course, sort of engineering students are always in really high demand, and anyone who can code. So it's a huge part of how we think of both assisting the startups with great sort of access to really skilled labor, but it's also an amazing way to sort of close the gap and making this a valuable program for the students.
So we have one more question here before we're going to get the hook on us for the next program. And so we'll leave it with this last question, which I'm going to adapt from one of the ones on Slido, which is basically a lot of the folks here have funded research projects. And so I'm wondering if you have any sort of last words of either support or thoughts as these folks look to how to take funded research projects and get them into the commercial space.
So I would just say to kind of think about what the right path forward is, whether it's just growing the company, whether it's selling or licensing the technology off to a larger company that can commercialize it, or whether it really is a venture-backed, potentially venture-backed startup. And then find mentors. We have a lot of, I'm sure you both have mentors. We have a mentor network. Others do as well that can help coach on how to actually commercialize the technology, that have done it before, or at least maybe invested in companies that have done it.
Yeah, again, very much the same. I think sort of making use of the opportunities that are out there to get help with figuring out which of these pathways to take is a really good point. Many of the startups that we have coming in are maybe a 1 full-time founder when they come in, and then they have 2 part-time employees, and then they use an accelerator program and all the mentorship and all that stuff, right, in order to precisely figure out by the end of it, what is my path to commercialization. So really make use of those kind of resources that are out there to get that help that you need. I think that's what we see a lot. Yeah.
Any other thoughts you'd like to share, Matt, on some of the early stages for you and what helped?
I was all ears listening since we have a funded research project. I mean, it's I guess I'd take maybe an example of what was shared up here is figuring out that business model and rolling and sticking with it. we at SailDRONE are a bit different in the space that we're a data as a service provider, so we don't sell our vehicles. And I think that decision about that was decided early on, and that was a conscious decision from the company that we're going to do things a bit differently than how it's been done in the space before, where traditionally someone just buys the asset and from there it's theirs. We're a data company, and so that's and that has worked really well for us. It's different, and it takes a while for people to adjust to it and understand it, but it solves one of the problems that Hilary mentioned, which is cost. It is a significant cost reduction for doing work in the maritime space, because you don't have the procurement asset of it. And so I think that's a good example of what you all were talking about deciding early on what your business model is going to be, what your path to commercialization, and how you're going to stand out and ultimately, hopefully save people money.
And I'll add one more for the end. If you're in a university or college, get to know your tech transfer office. It's really hard to get the technology out if you haven't started those conversations early. So that's my my small piece to add to that conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your lunch with us to the audience and for sharing your insights with us for the panelists. And we'll look forward to talking with you at the next break. All right.